So we need to talk about the BIOS. Now this is on PCs. What happens is we use the BIOS to initiate the power on self test. This is physically the machine says I'm supplying power and I need to know about all the devices that I have. So the post initializes all of the hardware. It's like when you wake up in the morning. Okay, my eyes are working. My mouth is working because I heard the yawn. My ears are working, okay, because I heard the yawn and I produced the yawn. I got all my digits that I went to bed with. I've got them all now. Okay, I know about all these things, and now let me take the next step. It checks the disk drive. That's the first thing that it does. Well, first it tests the RAM, and it actually counts up the RAM. We don't ever see that anymore, especially with the quantities of RAM that are actually in our machines. We check the disk drives themselves. Also, by the way, the other reason we don't count up the RAM anymore is because most of the time we're inserting ECC, error correction code RAM, and if it has a problem, it'll route around that particular problem and won't even tell us about it. So we may lose 1 or 2K, but we'll never know it. We check the disk drives, and then we attempt to find the valid operating system. We find that at that section on the hard drive where the bootloader is. And this just says, okay, at this point, go to the original booting program and give me, if there's more than one operating system, give me the boot options. Now, you'll see this every once in a while by hitting the interrupt key at the very beginning of the boot process, where you might see, for Windows machines, you might have to hit F8, or it's usually hardware dependent at that point. And what it'll say is, okay, you can boot to alternate operating systems. You'll see this if you shut down your Windows machine inappropriately, it will go into safe mode, which is a stripped down version of the operating system. Sometimes, like when we have a grub loader, what will happen is the bootloader program will say you have multiple operating systems to choose from. This little menu that you have right in front of you just allows us to go find those particular operating systems that are in other locations on the disk drive. Most of the time today what we do is the multiple stage bootloader. Here's my menuing option, and then, okay, let's take that big leap forward and load the operating system of your choice. So let's walk through the steps here. The system clock generates a series of clock ticks which initializes the CPU itself. That gets the timing mechanisms going. The CPU looks to the system startup program and the ROM BIOS for its first instruction. What do I do next? The first instruction is to run the power on self test and determine the memory addresses. Then what happens is the post checks the BIOS chip and tests the CMOS of the RAM. This is that patting down and figuring out what I went to bed with is what I woke up with. If there's no battery failure, the power on self checks the inventory of the hardware and then initializes the CPU. And if everything's working out just fine, that's when we start reaching over into that drive. The BIOS looks on the CMOS chip to find the drive where the OS is installed. Because remember, we can have multiple drives on that particular chain. If we go back to the old days of IDE, you would have the primary and the secondary drive, and the primary would be the one that it would seek the operating system from on the first sector, and then it would say, okay, load up what you've got there. Today what happens is we get more of a menuing structure that allows us in that multi-stage bootloader to actually choose from operating systems that may be anywhere on any of the drives. BIOS checks the boot record. The BIOS copies itself into memory after the operating system initializes. In other words, the operating system needs to know, okay, this is where I'm mapped to physically on the hard drive, so that I can then tell the physical hardware, this is where you're going to go get your next instruction from or your next piece of programming from. The OS takes over control of the boot process at this point. The BIOS has done its job. It's ready to go. And then the OS performs its inventory, its system memory. It says, what are my facilities that I have now? And then it initializes the full boot of the operating system, which we'll talk about next.